June the 4th, 1989, the date of the Polish elections, the Ufa train disaster, the Tiananmen Square massacre, had also seen the death of the Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder and supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. He was 89 and had suffered 5 heart attacks in 10 days. The body went on public display on the 5th of June, just as Tank Man was standing in Chang'an Avenue, and millions turned out in Tehran to say their farewells and partake in a farewell prayer as the coffin was opened. The crowds at the state funeral were such that the authorities lost control, and 8 people were killed in the stampede, leading to the postponement of the funeral. In the end, the interment was rather anticlimactic. To defeat the enormous crowds trying to reach the Ayatollah's body to touch his shroud or take a relic, the Revolutionary Guards had to helicopter him in a solid metal box, push their way through to the grave, pull the lid off, roll him in, and put some concrete slabs and a shipping container on top to prevent the body from being dug up. A few days later, the President of the Republic, Ali Hosseini Khamenei, was elected as the new Supreme Leader, having been chosen by Khomeini before his death. The 2 weeks between the US and Canadian races were pretty quiet by comparison, as Pope John Paul II visited Finland, Denmark and Sweden. Robert Ballard's deep-sea exploration team discovered the wreck of the German battleship Bismarck in the Atlantic, where it had lain since being sunk by the Royal Navy in 1941, and on the day of the Canadian Grand Prix, the second round of the Polish election took place. Solidarity weren't taking part in this round of the election, and turnout was spectacularly low, just 25%, compared to 62.7% in the first round, which was itself surprisingly low. And in Paramaribo, the capital of Suriname, a Douglas DC-8 of Suriname Airways crashed on landing, killing 176 of the 187 on board, including most members of an exhibition football team, the Kleurrijk Elftal, the Colourful 11, composed of professional Dutch footballers of Surinamese descent or birth, who were due to play a friendly against the local champions SV Robin Hood. Several more senior professionals had been denied permission by their clubs to travel, otherwise Frank Rijkaard, Ruud Gullit, Aaron Winter, Brian Roy, Stanley Menzo, Reggie Blinker and others might also have been on board. And the motor racing world was saddened to hear that British aircraft and car designer Maurice Philippe had taken his own life at 57 years old. Philippe had begun his career with de Havilland at the cutting edge of British aviation in the 1950s, before designing his first sports car and his first race car, the Delta, along with his friend Brian Hart, which was destroyed by driver Peter Waugh during its first race. Philippe tried driving himself in the early 60s, but in 1965 Colin Chapman brought him into Lotus on the design team, where he worked on the Lotus 49, the Lotus 56 turbine Indy car, and the all-conquering Lotus 72. In 1972, he moved to the US and worked for Parnelli in both Indy and F1, before returning home in 1978 to be chief designer of Tyrrell, where his career somewhat stalled as his tenure coincided with the rapid decline of the team's fortunes. He had been hired by March to design their latest Indy car, the March 89CR, fitted with an Alfa Romeo engine. He delivered the car, which was driven on its debut by Roberto Guerrero, but died by suicide the following day. As the F1 mid-season approached, there were rumours swirling. Prost's win in Phoenix seemed to have improved his mood, and he let it be known he was postponing his decision on whether to leave McLaren, while John Barnard had reportedly turned down Ferrari's offer of a new contract when his current one ended in October, leading to speculation about his possible destination and replacement. Williams would, it was announced, have exclusive use of the Renault V10 engine once more in 1990, while Lotus's miserable form, which could yet see them drop into pre-qualifying after the British Grand Prix, was said to be about to cost them their lavish Camel sponsorship. The Coloni team, having sent only a skeleton crew to the last couple of races, arrived in Canada with a full complement and a new car, Christian Vanderplijn's C3, in a charcoal white, blue and yellow scheme that everyone agreed was much better than the seasick-looking previous one. Whether it would go any quicker would soon be evident, but it looked a neat little package with a 3-shaft gearbox and an innovative front suspension design. There was just one chassis though, which meant that if Raffinel made it through PQ, he'd have to revert to the old car for qualifying proper. Ozella had also flown out a new chassis for Nicola Larini, who'd been using the one he crashed in Imola that had been patched up, and along with a new Pirelli compound he took to a damp track on Friday morning and made it through pre-qualifying with relative ease, behind Stefano Modena making it 6 out of 6, for Brabham topping the PQ tables. Johansson brought his Onyx through again, but in fourth was Alex Caffey, with Martin Brundle suffering a number of car issues to be the first driver in 1989 to fail to pre-qualify a Brabham. Gachot's Onyx was similarly stricken with car issues, and Raffanel, Montreal first-timer and with no testing in the C3, gingerly shook the car down but was never in danger of making it through, while Suzuki demolished his Zaxbyid against a wall and would take no further part in proceedings. So PHR handed over the C3 to Roberto Moreno for qualifying, and while Friday afternoon was fine, the weather closed in again on Saturday and the session was cold, overcast and damp. So with a few exceptions, most people went fastest on Friday, and just for once it was Alain Prost who topped the sheets, albeit by a wafer-thin margin of 0.076 seconds over Senna. Riccardo Patrese, buoyed by his Phoenix result, was third, ahead of the two Ferraris and teammates Boutsen. Modena and Caffey, two pre-qualifiers, shared row 4, with De Cesaris and Alio both having excellent qualifying sessions on row 5. Arrows, Benetton and Tyrrell, who had all had pretty good races in Arizona, were less happy. Warwick and Cheever were 12th and 16th, Nannini 13th, Palmer and Alboreto 14th and 20th, and Johnny Herbert had failed to qualify entirely, both Benetton drivers having had all kinds of problems setting up their cars. Larini put his Azella 15th and Johansson was 18th in the Onyx, just ahead of Piquet's Lotus. Gugelmin and Capelli were also all at 6s and 7s in the new March, 17th and 21st respectively, and Roberto Moreno snuck the new Coloni onto the back of the grid, squeezing Nakajima out by just 1/100th of a second. The other two non-qualifiers were Yannick Dalmas and Olivier Gouillard, who'd had gearbox problems. Sunday morning dawned with a downpour and stiff winds, and while the rain had mostly eased off by racetime, the track was still only partially dry and wind was still blowing debris across the track. As the start approached, the question of what tyres to fit was becoming a critical one. It didn't look quite dry enough for slicks, but it was too dry for wets to last long. With almost everyone opting for wets, they lined up for the start, and Berger stalled, waving his arm in the air as the yellow flags came out, and a restart was called, knocking a lap off the planned 70. By the time they'd filtered round for the second parade lap, the track was looking pretty dry along the racing line, and Mansell, Nannini and Sala all elected to peel into the pit lane at the end of the lap, change to slicks and start from there, on the basis that everyone else would have to stop for slicks after a few laps anyway, so they might as well get it done now. Unfortunately, thanks to a miscommunication at race control, Mansell and Nannini were released onto the track, just seconds before the green flag was waved and the start procedure began. The red and then green lights went on, and away they all went, with Prost leading Senna away, but presumably expecting to trip over Mansell and Nannini at any moment. Berger and Patrese banged wheels through the first hairpin, with the Williams coming out ahead. Behind Berger were Caffey, Boutsen and De Cesaris, with the Belgian getting ahead of Caffey over the course of lap 1. Martini had started well, but collided with Modena and both were out, and Alboreto's Tyrrell had an electrical failure and he rolled round to retire, so that was 3 out on lap 1. By the end of the first lap, the two McLarens had clear track between themselves and Patrese, who led a little train of Berger, Boutsen and De Cesaris, with Caffey diving in for slicks at the end of the opening lap. The sun was out and the track was drying rapidly as Prost caught up to Nannini, but before he could overtake he slowed and Senna stormed past, as Prost came in at the end of lap 2 for slicks, having a slow stop and returning to the track's 17th, only to tour around and come back in, off camera, to retire with broken front suspension. So Senna now led, and disposed of Nannini while the cameras were watching something else, and was now approaching Mansell. Senna, clearly quicker on wets than Mansell on his slicks, decided to stay out one more lap, and then came in at the end of lap 4, leaving Patrese and Boutsen leading, with Berger right on the tail of the Belgian. The circuit was still rapidly drying, and Berger took second as Boutsen moved over to cool his tyres. Before long the Ferrari was right behind Patrese, and it was looking like he would take the lead, while Senna had come back out onto the track 4th and was chasing Boutsen to make his way back onto the podium. And then it started raining again, but just on the far side of the circuit. Tarquini slithered off just after passing Arnoux for 8th, on the same lap as Berger's charge ended very prematurely with a broken alternator belt. So on lap 8, Senna was up to 3rd on slick tyres, chasing the two wet-shod Williamses of Patrese and Boutsen, with Warwick, Larini and Arnoux making up the top 6, as Mansell and Nannini were finally black flagged in for starting procedure violations. It wasn't really their fault, and a particularly bitter pill to swallow for Benetton, whose race was over before it had even begun, but difficult to know what the stewards could have done differently in the situation. A few laps later, Boutsen decided to go in for slicks, as Senna set the fastest lap, which raised Warwick to 3rd and Danner into the points. The tricky conditions claimed another victim as Sala slid backwards into the wall just in time to be missed by a passing Patrese. Senna had the gap now down to 4 seconds, but it started raining again in earnest, and it became very difficult to actually follow what was going on, as cars came in and out of the pits for tyres, shot up the order and dropped down again. Johansson provided a bit of off-camera comedy when he came into the pits for new tyres and exited trailing tyre gun, air hose and a bit of gantry. He was black flagged too, and then a few laps later disqualified for having ignored them. Senna was using all his considerable skill to keep the car on the slippery track on his slick tyres, not always succeeding, while the wet-shod Derek Warwick bore down on him. Behind Derek, a fine three-way all-Italian scrap had developed between Caffi, De Cesaris and Larini over 4th through 6th places. Larini took 5th off De Cesaris, just as Boutsen came in to switch back to wets. Senna did the same shortly afterwards, so Warwick went past into 2nd, while Caffi dropped behind the other two Italians, putting Larini up to 3rd. In an Azella. The left front wheel fell off Moreno's new Coloni, and he wobbled round to the pits for a new one, giving his sponsors a little TV time at least, and Caffi was having problems of his own as he skated around on slicks, having an off-track excursion and then swapping ends, before finally bowing to the inevitable and coming in. Boutsen was 6th now and charging. Next up was René Arnoux, and this time he was racing for position, not being lapped, so there was absolutely no imperative for him to move over, and he didn't, until the superior Renault grunt told on the start-finish straight. By now, the track was absolutely drenched again, sending Capelli aquaplaning off to end up next to Tarquini's AGS. Alio, having briefly been as high as 3rd, also went off, as Senna passed Larini to go up to 3rd, then lapped Moreno, now with 4 wheels on his wagon once again. Boutsen had a spin of his own, gracefully pirouetting 360 degrees and giving himself the job of passing Arnoux and De Cesaris all over again. Ah yes, Arnoux and De Cesaris in the wet with points on the line. What could possibly go wrong? Nothing, actually. Andrea made a gung-ho but successful move at the hairpin, made it stick and took the place. Larini's excellent race ended in another disappointing breakdown, this time with an electrical failure on lap 33, about half distance, and at that point Patrese came in for new tyres. Warwick had been closing relentlessly and Ricciardo's tyres were clearly worn, so Derek Warwick took the lead for the first time since his Renault days, while Boutsen had made his way ahead of the terrible two, so on lap 35 Warwick led Senna, with Patrese and Boutsen 3rd and 4th, then De Cesaris and Arnoux. But there was still a long way and a lot of weather to go. Palmer had made his way up to 8th before spinning off, and Senna was taking lumps out of Warwick's lead to the tune of 4 seconds a lap. Behind them, Piquet had quietly made his way up through the field and was now sitting behind Arnoux and looking for that last point, which, if he got it, would be Lotus's first of the year. Warwick's engine gave up on lap 41, having just been passed by Senna, who swept into a commanding lead, and with his wet-weather mastery and bulletproof car was now odds-on to win the race. He came upon the duelling veterans as Piquet took what was now 5th off Arnoux, thanks to Warwick's misfortune. Things had by now settled down a bit, with just 9 cars left running, the rain obviously here to stay and everyone on the right tyres. De Cesaris put some distance between himself and Arnoux, sufficient for a bit of impromptu rallycross without losing the place. By now, it was Patrese's turn to lap Piquet, who in turn was lapping Dana's 8th place Real, and Ricciardo had his teammate right on his rear wing to boot. Frank and Patrick, back in the pits, would have been praying that their boys didn't do anything silly in the treacherous conditions, given there were by now just 7 laps to go, and they were running 2nd and 3rd. As Piquet took Dana, Boutsen made a move and took 2nd from Patrese, who had a look but couldn't get back alongside. It turned out later his rear diffuser was worked loose and he was struggling for back-end grip. And then, with just 2 laps to go and a huge lead, Senna pulled over with that rarest of things, a Honda engine failure. As he bumped to a halt in a cloud of steam, Thierry Boutsen came past a pit sign showing P1. Driving the most careful lap he'd ever driven, Boutsen came round to take the checkered flag for his maiden Grand Prix win, the first new race winner in F1 since Gerhard Berger back in 1986. Patrese had backed right off, the only other car on the lead lap, and came in 2nd, for the 3rd race running, just over 30 seconds behind, with De Cesaris taking a fine 3rd and Piquet 4th, both unlapping themselves at the end. Arnoux took his first points of the year in 5th, and even Caffi got in on the act to take the final point 2 laps down, the first time both Scuderia Italia cars had finished in the points, and their first podium finish, which would cheer the team bosses up no end after the contretemps in Phoenix. Senna was classified 7th, and Christian Dana, 3 laps down after a series of spins, was the only other runner. And Jonathan Palmer had the fastest lap of the race for the first time ever, sat on lap 11 on a drying track. Neither McLaren finished, a pretty rare occurrence on its own, meaning that it was as you were at the top of the drivers' standings, with Patrese holding on to third, but Boutsen elbowing Mansell down into fifth, while Williams, the only major team to score, brought the gap in the Constructors' Championship down from ludicrous to merely significant. Back home to Europe then, and hopefully some drier weather for the French Grand Prix at Paul Ricard, a race Prost would be very keen to do well in, not to mention the rest of the French contingent, Ligier, Larousse, AGS, and of course Renault in the back of the Williamses. But for the moment, the party in the Williams garage would go on for some time. After a dreadful 1988, the team had got not just a win, but a 1-2, and Thierry Boutsen may have been a bit lucky, but neither he nor anyone else would care. A popular driver who had worked hard to get there.
Today the car finished the race without any problem. I made one mistake. I spun once on the track when I had got a lot of aquaplaning. The track was very wet. Recovered from that, luckily without touching anything, and then carried on as hard as I could. Every lap was win or lose. Every lap was crash or win. So I did everything I could to go as fast as possible during the race, and I was lucky to finish first.